from our 22 News Broadcast Center, this is 22 News in Focus. Today, public safety versus constitutional rights, the debate over gun control laws. Here's Laura Hutchinson.
Good Sunday afternoon and welcome to 22 News in Focus. I'm Laura Hutchinson. The topic of gun control has been an issue for several years now. Mass shooting incidents have fueled this conversation, and it's taken on an even stronger tone since the tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Questions about protecting a citizen's Second Amendment rights and the right to government to ensure public safety come into play when you do have this conversation. And that's where 22 News in Focus comes in today. Today we're going to weigh the pros and cons of stricter gun control laws with two people who view this issue very differently. Joining us today, we have Jerry Belair, Legislative Director for Stop Handgun Violence, a nonprofit organization committed to the prevention of gun violence. And we have David Kopacz, President of Massachusetts Republican Assembly, an organization that, among other things, supports the rights of citizens to bear arms. I want to thank you both so much for being here today. Two people who will see not always see eye to eye on this issue, at least. And that's why we bring the two together, to have a good conversation about this topic. First of all, we've had unfortunately, several mass shootings in the past couple of years. Do you think it's fair after the tragedy at Sandy Hook to have this conversation again? It seems like this has really been renewed and it's really fueled this conversation. Do you think that that's a fair move?
I think it's absolutely fair. We've had more than several. We've had 62 mass shootings in this country. I think that Newtown was particularly difficult because there were, kindergartners. There were 6 and 7 year old kids that were just murdered with as many as 11 shots to these little beautiful bodies. And they were using a military style weapon with just incredible ammunition, which is meant to cause the maximum amount of damage possible to soft tissue. And so, yeah, it's about time we had this conversation. We should have had it a long time ago.
David, how do you feel about that?
I'm all for a public dialogue, but I want to make sure that we're addressing the problem and not the symptom. And I think there's an underlying story to be told regarding what's possibly prompting people to do these terrible things. And I would say that we need to start looking at toxicology, for example, what some of the medications these folks are on that have done these terrible things, because we're finding now that many of these mass shootings involve people that have been on antidepressants and a variety of different pharmaceuticals that have, as an effect, homicidal and suicidal thought tendencies. So I would say that the use of guns might be just opportunistic, that these violent things that are happening, although we only hear about the big shootings on the news, we don't hear when someone is maimed with a bat or a hammer or another tool in a violent act. And you'll see that in those cases that the correlation is the pharmaceuticals. And
so would you agree that guns needs to be a part of the conversation?
I think it's a part of the conversation, but I want to make sure that we're not addressing symptoms here, that we really get to the core problem. I think guns are just one of the many tools that's expressed in a violent way from a demographic of people.
Jerry,
well,
yeah.
I'm going to have to disagree because, in Canada, in Great Britain, in Japan, they have video games, violent video games. They have pharmaceuticals. They have all of the same issues that we have here, but they don't have the gun fatality rates. The difference, if you're looking for causation, the difference between those countries and this country is easy access to guns. Now, 40% of gun sales in this country are conducted without a background check. What people don't realize is that 6.6 million guns a year are sold without the benefit of a background check. In 33 states in this nation, you can walk into a store and buy a gun without a background check.
Now, is that from laws that aren't being enforced, or
No.
are those laws that that you feel aren't strong enough?
These are exemptions that were promoted and lobbied and by the National Rifle Association and were passed into legislation by a complicit Congress. They allow exemptions. They call them funny names like collector's exemptions, but anybody in 33 states that wants to buy an AK-47 or 10 AK-47s or Uzis or anything, even a Barrett 50 caliber, can walk into a gun show in 33 states and buy it, no questions asked. Now, criminals, terrorists, and an occasional mentally ill are certainly not the majority of the gun problems. In many cases, the mentally ill aren't violent, but they are part of the problem. And we need to enter that information, mental status information, into the background checks, into the national background checks, so that anybody that's prohibited by virtue of having a mental illness doesn't get a gun. But more importantly, we have to make sure that there is a background check on terrorists and criminals who are buying guns in gun shows to the tune of 6.6 million firearms a year.
What are your thoughts on the gun show? We obviously have one here in Western Massachusetts. You know, is that something that you think needs to be looked at as well? I mean, Massachusetts is known for having strict gun laws. Do you think that gun shows need to be considered? Because that is one of the places where people will obtain their guns. Well,
two of the primary reporting sources for the Massachusetts Department of Health report that there's been a 50% and 57% increase in violent crime after the Gun Control Act came into effect. So I think it's had a reverse effect, and as many have brought out before, and I stand behind this myself, is that criminals, when there's laws against rape, there's laws against many things, and the criminal element is not going to comply. When they pass these gun laws, you are regulating good people from being able to protect themselves. The criminals are not going to, the criminal mind does not adhere to laws. There's no law they can pass that's going to pull the guns out of the criminals' hands.
Well, Massachusetts has the lowest gun fatality rate in the nation. In 1998, the Massachusetts the legislature rewrote the laws. They made some very efficient and effective laws, common sense laws, that don't take guns out of the hands of legal citizens, but do take guns out of the hands of criminals. It's much more difficult in Massachusetts for a criminal to get a gun. As a result, we have the lowest gun fatality rate in the nation, even though we're an industrial state. Now, that doesn't stop crime, because in New Hampshire, in Vermont, in Maine, they have weak gun laws. In fact, 60% of the guns that are recovered in crime in Massachusetts are from out of state. Now, rural states like New Hampshire have twice the gun fatality rate of Massachusetts. Maine has more than twice the gun fatality rate of Massachusetts. Vermont has more than 3 times the gun fatality rate of Massachusetts, and these are rural states. We have a heavily industrial state with big cities, and we've managed to limit ourselves to 3.1 fatalities per 100,000 people as a result of those laws.
I do want to talk more about the state laws and also what the president has recently proposed as well, and sort of compare the two and see what your opinions are on that. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll pick up there when we get back. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. Today we're talking about gun control. We're continuing our conversation now with Jerry Belair of Stop Handgun Violence and David Kopacz of Massachusetts Republican Assembly. I want to thank you again both so much for being here. In the last segment, we discussed the state laws as well. I also want to talk about the proposals that the president made to strengthen gun laws, across the country. One of those proposals was the ban on military-style assault weapons. And I want to know what you think about that, because that's something that we have here in Massachusetts. How effective is that? Is that something that you think could actually make a difference? Can I ask you that?
I find that to be a lot of imagery and propaganda. Many of these weapons that are called assault-style weapons and military-style weapons are based off from the scary silhouette of a gun with a banana clip. And I can assure you that when we discuss about regulating semi-automatic guns, for example, it sounds much more threatening than it actually is we find that many of the most common guns that are used for hunting, and I can't stress enough that The Second Amendment has nothing to do with hunting or sport shooting, but that is a lot of times what this discussion is framed around. But this would pull the guns out of the hands of many, many people that do use them for that purpose. And I like to emphasize some of the good that happens with guns. You know, as a very young boy, I was lucky to have a close relationship with my grandfather, and I learned many of life's lessons sitting on an old mossy stump in the woods with my grandfather and his old Model 12 shotgun. Today that's considered an assault weapon because it holds more than 5 rounds in it. And although we never harmed a single creature in the woods, there was actual good that came from that ability for us to have that in our possession legally, spend that time together as a family. So there's good things that happen that we don't often hear about.
So you don't feel like that you can have that, share that bond with, you know, a regular handgun or a regular, you know what I'm saying? What is it about the assault? You know, I mean, you know, you hear these conversations about trying to reach a compromise here. Why do you need to have, you know, a high-powered weapon like that to continue your hunting traditions? I mean, can you continue those with other weapons?
Well, we got to bring that back to the true intent of the Second Amendment, which was not only for personal security, but in defense of tyranny. So to say, should you have a high-capacity weapon, I say yes, our government does, and so should we. There's nothing, in fact, there's rulings that say that any weapon that the military could use, we should be able to use as well. So we got to bring the Second Amendment back to defending this country against tyranny. It's not about hunting.
Okay, so you think anything that the military has that the regular citizen should be able to have?
Any law-abiding citizen should not be prohibited from exercising their rights.
I have to disagree. Military-style assault weapon, first of all, a 5-round capacity isn't deemed to be an assault weapon. It's 10 rounds and more. So the gun that Dave was talking about is not banned under an assault weapons ban. But more importantly, these weapons are weapons that are made for military purposes. When they aren't used for hunting, they aren't used for home protection. They're too unwieldy for home protection. And hunting. When I was hunting as a boy, when I was duck hunting, I had a J.C. Higgins 5-shot pump. It was illegal to have more than 3 shells in your gun in order to protect populations of ducks. You had to actually put 2 wooden plugs in, or you would violate the law. So the NRA and others are saying now that they don't have a problem with restricting the number of shots that you can have in a shotgun to go duck hunting to protect ducks. Mm-hmm. But that they have a problem with the number of rounds that you put in an assault weapon that are killing our citizens. That doesn't make any sense at all. You take an assault weapon, it has no value whatsoever except in the military use. Now, we're hearing now that it's for protection against a renegade federal government. Well, you know, have you heard of suicide by cop? A guy may walk up with a gun and point it at a police officer in order to get himself killed. Well, if you've got an M16, if you're lucky enough to have an M16, an AK-47, an Uzi, I mean, that's suicide by Air Force.
And he's saying that he would like, you know, citizens to be able to have what the military has, and you just
they don't have it.
Totally disagree.
We can't
with that.
have an Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're not talking about taking an AK-47 and going against a renegade federal government soldier with an AK-47. We've got an Air Force out there.
What if we,
ridiculous
you know,
argument.
what if you looked at the other elements of this and, you know, limiting what you could buy to go with it, limiting the rounds, you know, Obama's even called for, you know, increased funding for the mental health, you know. Do you think that these other elements could contribute without taking away assault?
Absolutely. I think that we should have a requirement under mental health. Anyone that's deemed to be mentally ill should be reported to the National Background System. Mm-hmm. A person who wants to have a license should have to sign a release, a HIPAA release, you know, so that they can release that portion mm-hmm. of their health that pertains specifically to mental health. And if they don't want to sign that release, then they don't have to get a gun. You know, they don't have to get a license. So yeah, there's that. There's a number of other ways. We can restrict the number of rounds to 10 and not affect hunters' ability to hunt or a person's ability to protect their home. All of these things make sense, and nobody's coming after their guns. I'm a gun owner. I've been a gun owner my entire life. You know, we're not taking guns. Nobody's talking about taking guns. We're talking about common sense laws that will keep our children safe. We had 6- and 7-year-old children in Connecticut. Beautiful little kids that were just gunned down by a mentally ill individual with an assault weapon. It doesn't make any sense.
I believe those were handguns that were used, and the initial reports were not accurate in that account. But I would point back to the LA riots, where many businesses were burnt to the ground during that time, and the only ones that stood were the ones that had Americans on the roof with these horrible assault weapons. They held crowds of marauders at bay. I tell you, those people had a legitimate defense use of those weapons, and they used them accordingly. No one was hurt. They defended their property, and their businesses were not burnt to the ground. They were not handguns that were used at Newtown. Yeah, that's revisionist history. Revisionist history isn't going to establish good policy here. We've got to start telling the truth about what's really going on in this country. Now, finally, people are paying attention. You cannot fight off the United States government with an AK-47 or a Bushmaster. You can do things like Columbine, Aurora, Newtown. That's what you can do with these things. You cannot fight off the government. So they have no util use whatsoever in a civilian population.
David, do you feel there's any part of this argument that you can give a little? You know, I mean, you've seen these mass shootings happen as well. I think we're seeing those more than we're seeing riots even right now. So can you explain which part of this you would be willing to give a little? You know, where do you see the compromise
I'm
happening?
not completely unbending. I see the real need to look into the behavioral disorders again, because I'm convinced that either just the criminal element or people that have had their behavior altered by medications will find other avenues to do terrible things to good people. So I'm in favor of a certain level of mental screening to make sure we get the right help to these people, not to just take their guns away, but to make sure that we help them become a productive member of society.
Okay,
But the issue...
You know, I'm going to stop us right there. We'll pick up after the break. Stay with us. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. If you are just joining us, we've been discussing state and federal gun control laws. We talked about the current state laws, and we also talked about proposed federal laws. Joining our conversation now with Jerry Belair of Stop Handgun Violence and David Kopacz of Massachusetts Republican Assembly. Thank you again so much for being here. Obviously, these mass shootings have become so frequent. There's a lot of copycat shooters, and one point you've mentioned is if someone wants to do this, they're going to continue to do this. My question to you is, or they'll find a way to do it. My question to you is there any way to prevent this from happening in the future? Any real way? You know, we've talked a lot of different elements of this law. What do you think is possible for our future right now? You know, this is obviously a very heated, you know, debate that
I think in many cases we're actually advertising potential crime scenes. As we run around the nation declaring our school campuses gun-free zones, to the criminal element, this is like shooting fish in a barrel. I like to see press releases come out where a school district says that their staff and faculty have all been trained in the proper protection of their students, that half of them are trained in the proficient use of a firearm, that there are actually defenses on the campus for these adults to do the responsible thing in protecting these kids.
Do you think there needs to be more police officers, or are you actually talking about teachers and staff having guns?
I think the faculty and staff should be right there. I don't want to turn our schools into like a police state scenario with armed officers standing at guard. I don't think that's the right environment for our young people to see. But I think the parents and the people out there need to know that these schools are safe for their kids to go to.
So increase the training is what you're saying?
Absolutely.
But Laura, you see, this is the problem, and this is what the gun lobby has done to this country over the past couple decades. At one time, the NRA and the gun lobby were hunters, friends of hunters and protecting the environment. Now they've become the Madison Avenue for the gun industry. What they've done is, through their legislation, has made it possible for 40% of gun sales in this country to be made without a background check. So terrorists, criminals, and mentally ill individuals can be armed. 6.6 million guns without a background check being sold in this country every single year. Now that they've managed to arm terrorists and criminals and the mentally ill, now they want to convince the rest of us to protect ourselves by arming ourselves, to protect ourselves against criminals, the mentally ill, and terrorists. And who benefits from that? The gun industry. The gun industry contributes millions of dollars to the NRA every single year, who then funnel that money to our elected officials and to advertising that supports laws that make it easier and easier for the gun industry to put guns into the hands of people. $32 billion a year industry. 40% of $32 billion is $13 billion.
Well, it was not the NRA that funded Fast and Furious. The very government that is about to disarm us, it has sent illegal weapons over to Mexico. They have bought hundreds of thousands of rounds of hollow point ammunition, which is illegal to use in a war theater under the Geneva Convention. So those hollow point rounds that the government bought, I need to ask, are they pointed at?
Actually, the people in Fast and
funded illegal weapons going to Mexico.
The people in Fast and Furious were people who were buying guns without a background check at gun shows, primarily in Texas. Fast and Furious was tracking those people and tracking those guns not very well as they went to Mexico.
Go over the border
But they were purchased without background checks by terrorists.
Do you think we're going to be seeing a change here? Any of these laws proposed federally go into place, or do you think this is something that we're going to see drag on for?
I think they're going to try to do a national registration, and they're going to try to outlaw many guns, but I see a citizenry who is more focused on the Second Amendment than the hunting aspect of this.
I've got to stop you there. I do want to thank you both so much for joining us, though we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. This is obviously one of those conversations we will, again, continue on another program. Stay with us, so we'll have the last word for you after the break. You're watching 22 News in Focus. Welcome back to 22 News in Focus. For the last half hour, we've discussed the pros and cons of gun control. We talked about current state and proposed federal laws. We hope this program has helped you form an opinion on the controversial topic if you haven't formed one already. That is our program for today. I want to thank our guests for joining us. If you missed any of this and you want to watch it, you can watch it in full on our website at www.lpn.com. Thanks, everyone. Great.